Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for this panel program, Research Stories from Virginia Untold at the Library of Virginia. My name is Lydia. I am the project manager for Virginia Untold here at the library, and I'm really excited to start this conversation this evening. Before we get started, I'm going to give a little overview for how the program is going to go. I do want to let everyone know that you can drop questions into the chat at any time. We have our education outreach team monitoring behind the scenes. So if you guys have questions, feel free to use the chat for that function. I am going to reserve 20 minutes at the end of this program, though, for questions from the audience. So there will be time for that as well. This program will be recorded and hopefully available sometime next week on our social media pages. So if you aren't able to catch all of it, just know that we are recording it this evening. Our overview for tonight, I'm going to start by introducing Virginia Untold, sort of so we can all be on the same platform, understanding what we're talking about tonight. My panelists are going to be discussing various record types and parts of the project, and I just want us all to have a shared understanding about what the project is. So I'm going to try to keep that brief, hopefully about 15 minutes. Then we're going to get to the meat of the program, 45 minutes to an hour of talking with our panelists. I'll be asking them some questions and we'll be having some conversation. And then, like I said, 20 minutes reserved at the end for questions from you all. So this is really an opportunity to dive in if you have questions for them around Virginia Untold, their research. I want to reserve that opportunity for you all. I also want to start by saying that kind of my motivation for this program. I think that we have done a pretty good job of sharing out from the library, thinking about what we want to put in front of our users. And we don't always know how our records and our research is being used. I think we can do a lot of ways to better engage our researchers. And this panel event is just one of those. So it's just a small effort as trying to understand how people are using the research, where it's going, what are they doing with it? How can we improve? It's also an opportunity to get some feedback from our users. So I really am excited to hear what they have to say. And I think that their different perspectives will weave together really well to help us to understand that Virginia Untold can be used in a variety of ways. It might not just be for genealogy. It's not just for academic research. It really is it's a powerful tool. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen to talk a little bit about Virginia Untold. So just bear with me while I do so. And hopefully you all can see that. So again, just want to reiterate, I'm the project manager for Virginia Untold up here at the library. My contact information is there, but I have confidence that my colleagues will also drop that information in the chat box as well for those of you who want to follow up after this program. Let's talk a little bit about Virginia Untold. So this project facilitates digital access to records that document enslaved and free Black people in the Library of Virginia's collections. The records that are in there now are primarily pre-Civil War, pre-1865. Does go a little bit beyond that. I do hope that one day we can think about what post-emancipation records in Virginia Untold look like, but for right now, that's its focus. It kind of kicked off in 2013 as a naming project. We had staff, volunteers, interns going through these old records and pulling out names of individuals, really trying to get at identities and put them into a database. So there was a lot of processing, there was indexing, and then ultimately digitizing to put these records online. In 2011, Unknown No Longer at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture got started. So they were actually 2 years ahead of us on this work, started by Laurinette Lee. And we actually merged their records into Virginia Untold just a few years ago in 2019. So now you can access the Unknown No Longer project from the Virginia Untold website and database. So that's just to say the project has grown. It has gone from something that was just starting with pulling out names, kind of a digital collection really, to moving into really what we want it to now be, a project. And that was underscored even more most recently in February 2020 when we received a National Historical Publications and Records Commission grant from the National Archives to hire a project manager, who was me, to focus on two main things: digitizing almost 40 free Black registers in our collections currently, and then to focus on processing records from the city of Richmond from the 1790s until 1860, hiring a person that oversees this work 40 hours a week puts it beyond digital collection to a digital project. And a big part of my work, which is less highlighted, I think sometimes, is the outreach piece. How do we tell people about this work? How do we get people involved? What do people want from us? Those kind of questions are really integral to this work as well. So just to give you a sort of a visual of the type of stuff that we are sifting through day in and day out, this is a box of records from the city of Richmond, court records that I'm currently going through. But these bundles represent many of the court records that are now in Virginia Untold. They have been stored in courthouses and basements for years. They have not been paid attention to. There are names of hundreds of Black individuals in these documents that need to be brought to the surface. There are stories in here that need to be brought to light. And that's a big emphasis on Virginia Untold. That's the big motivation. Going through these things physically, making them available, preserving the records themselves, and then taking that step to digitizing them, indexing them, and making them searchable online. Another huge part that I mentioned just a minute ago of our current focus is digitizing these registers that document free people of color. The registers that we have currently in the Library of Virginia cover 17 localities. We have just gotten those digitized, and we're actually working on putting those on our transcription site from the page. We have 2 registers up there now if you all would like to help us out in transcribing those. Shameless plug. And we are also going to be working with clerks in various courthouses throughout the state to collect even more Black registers. In some cases, we will be asking permission just to scan those books and get the digital images and add those to Virginia Untold, or care for them in our collection. So we'd really like to get a comprehensive set. Those of you all who have researched this type of stuff, you all know how valuable these sources are. They give incredible descriptions of free Black people. Genealogically speaking, they are a very valuable resource. They need to be cared for and protected as well. So that is definitely a current focus. Look out for more on getting those available on our transcription site in the coming weeks, hopefully. And then I just want to point our attention to sort of how the site is currently set up on Virginia Untold. There are currently 22 record types within Virginia Untold. And what I mean by that is basically just a document type. This is the Virginia Untold site. For those of you who are unfamiliar with it, I just went to the Search the Narrative page, pulling up the record types here. This is one way that you can actually search the site. I know that our panelists this evening are going to be talking about things like tax records and coroner's inquisitions, bills of sale. And when they're referencing those things, they're referring to the various document types within the site. We've been pulling out these types of things like bills of sale and coroner's inquisitions from those court records, from those bundles, and organizing the site around this. I just wanted to sort of give us an overview of what those things look like. The image on the screen here is a free Black registration. Some of our panelists might be talking about that this evening as well. And then just to wrap up, I do want to mention that the Virginia Untold website will be changing soon. I believe for the better. It's going to have essentially the same search functions, but it will be visually different and I think much more intuitive. So just look out for that. You've probably heard me talk about this because it's been in the works for some time now, but the website will be changing in hopefully the next few months. Our digital repository will be changing as well. So that just means that when you go look at images online, they will hopefully be even more user-friendly to navigate through and work within. And so with that, I'm actually going to wrap up here. I think I've shared the various things that I would like to with you all this evening. And I would really like to go ahead and jump in with introducing our panelists and getting started on some questions. So I'm actually going to introduce you all as you're on my screen. I'm going to start with you, Joanne, and I'm going to introduce all of our panelists this evening. And then I am going to ask my first question and then let them take it from there. So Joanne Smith is a genealogist and has over 20 years of experience researching and documenting her African-American family in Virginia, North Carolina, New Jersey, and New York. I actually recently met Joanne as the result of a transcribathon back in October, and she's used Virginia Untold recently to find some really interesting stuff on her ancestor, and I'm looking forward to hearing a lot about that tonight. It was an exciting find for her, is what she's told me. Peyton Young is a public historian and second-year PhD student at the College of William and Mary. Peyton has done extensive research using LVA's collections, but has worked specifically within Virginia Untold quite a bit. Peyton is extremely knowledgeable about a variety of Black history throughout Virginia, and I think is going to offer a very in-depth perspective on using these types of documents. And Selma Stewart has been a genealogist and researcher for over 25 years. She is the past president of the Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society, the Hampton Roads chapter. She currently serves on the board of the Virginia Genealogical Society. And I just have to mention something Selma said recently in her bio to me. I think this is great. She said, "I started doing research in the summer of 1991 on what I thought would be a few months' journey, and I am still on it." And I do want to mention we had a fourth panelist for this evening. Wendy DeGroat unfortunately could not be with us, but I just want to say that our thoughts and prayers are with her right now. She is the librarian for the Maggie L. Walker's Governor's School. She's been doing transcription projects with her students using Virginia Untold since 2017. Wendy has a really different and unique perspective. She's sort of using the lens of her students to understand Virginia Untold, who were doing it as part of various transcription projects. And she has left me with some thoughts and some overview that I'm going to try my best to seamlessly integrate into tonight's discussion. I don't know how that's going to go, but I want to give her as much of a voice as possible in her absence this evening. So without further ado, I am just going to kick it off with our first question to Joanne, if you don't mind starting. I am going to ask all of our panelists to go around and explain what they do and sort of what motivates them to do the work using Virginia Untold, how they've used the platform. It's essentially the question, why do you think I've asked you to be here this evening? Why do you think I've asked you to be on this panel? So Joanne, if you don't mind getting started, I would love that.
Thank you, Lydia. What I do during the day, I'm a program analyst at the National Institutes of Health, but what I really do is I've been searching my family, which is from Pennsylvania County, my father's side in Virginia, and I'm really interested in what went on before the Civil War. And it's hard to find a lot of documents sometimes. You can get census records, but finding things that are digitized, like these random little hidden gems, and I'll talk more about that during my presentation, which really motivates me to kind of continue that line to help break through brick walls. And sometimes if I don't break through my own brick wall, I've helped others break through their brick walls, or hopefully some of the lessons I've learned I can share to motivate others how to think differently and out of the box to try to answer some of the questions using some of the original work that's been transcribed. And I want to remind myself now to thank all of the transcribers, because it hadn't been for a few people, I wouldn't have gotten through a brick wall that I had tried to blast through for many, many years.
Peyton, would you like to go next?
Well, my name is Peyton Young. It's always kind of interesting to have to say, oh, what it is that I do, because I think I wear a few too many hats. But as Lydia mentioned, I am a PhD student at the College of William and Mary. I'm also a public historian that currently works for the Quarter Place Enslaved People Cemetery Project at Patrick Henry's Red Hill Plantation in Brookneal, Virginia. I'm also a member of the Descendants Council of Greater Richmond, Virginia, which is focused on advocating for the preservation of historic Black cemeteries, as well as advocating for Black descendants in the Richmond metro area. And I mention those things because I think over the last several years, my profession and my personal life have come to a space where they've collided, I think, quite inevitably. My relatives were enslaved in Richmond, broader Henrico County, Amelia, and Culpeper, Virginia. Virginia Untold became the basis of two master's theses for me. And the Library of Virginia has records of my own family members that are well over 100 years old. And I think what motivates me not just to use Virginia Untold, but and to work with the Library of Virginia in general, which has just been absolutely wonderful, I think, in this early space in my career, is that they've given me the opportunity to be able to elevate Black voices in a way that I didn't imagine could possibly happen, especially for voices of Black people living in the early Republic period, as well as enslaved people. So I'm very proud of that and honored to be here.
Thank you, Peyton. Selma?
Well, as you mentioned, I started doing research in 1991, so that meant I was still using microfilm. You had to be at the library or the Family History Center or at the Library of Virginia in the actual or a courthouse. This digitization of these documents present an opportunity that earlier researchers didn't have. I researched both free and enslaved individuals who lived here in Virginia. So when they're free, your quest becomes how did they become free, whether born free or emancipated by will or deed, and if they're enslaved, who owned them. I was at the Hampton Public Library very early in my research and pulled a reel for the slave schedule. I don't remember which county it was, to see what a slave schedule looked like, and just pulled a microfilm reel of wills and deeds. And so I think for a lot of us, when you see that slave schedule for the first time, can be very disconcerting. There are no names there, or the names of the owners, and just statistical marks. And then when you go to the wills, you have, someone who's recently departed, and he's dividing his land and his property and his livestock. And I remember one of the first names I saw was, "And I leave Dicey and her future issue." And as I continued on that reel, it was the same thing. And I had to leave the library that day and say, can I do this? Do I want to do this? Because I understood at that moment what this was going to entail. Because it's not that the people we seek are not in the records, it's that they are not generating the records prior to 1865. So I think this digitization and this transcribing is a must for genealogists if you're interested in furthering your research. And so that's what I have.
Thank you, Selma. You've touched on some things that I hope that we'll have a chance to circle back on. Really strong points for people doing this type of research. I'm going to put a question to the group, and you all don't have to go in any particular order. The question I'd like to ask is about the concept of the research roadblock. And I think that this will allow you all to speak a little bit about your own personal research as well. So I'd like you all to describe a challenge or a setback that you experienced with your work or research journey. How did you overcome it? This could be a difficulty with the records themselves. It could be a technological issue. It could have been a personal issue that you ran into. You all could elaborate on that question.
Well, I think the thing about Virginia Untold, when I had first started doing research using it, I was actually using it for my first master's thesis, which was on enslaved people who had died by suicide and alcohol intoxication in Alexandria and Henrico County during the early Republic period, the first half of the early Republic period. And I found, as Selma was talking about earlier in her introduction, that a lot of these records, they're fragmentary representations of people. And for a lot of the enslaved people I encountered, this was the only thing that tied them to the existing world. I think that was something that was very difficult. And having, I think, Well, in one instance, I had encountered a woman, well, really, at the time, she was considered a woman, but currently we would consider her a child. She was a 16-year-old girl named Henny who had died by mysterious circumstances in Alexandria. And it was the only record I could find for her was a coroner's inquest of her death. And through finding that coroner's inquest, I kind of became obsessed with trying to piece back her life, because I just didn't think it was fair that this was the only thing of this person and her existence. And I had found the name of the coroner who had done her case. His name was Abraham Fawn, and it turned out he'd done a handful of cases with some questionable kind of conclusions, I guess, inconclusive cases that he had adjudicated. And I was able to find legal records pointing to the problematic ways that he had dealt with cases. And through investigating his own legal history, as well as trying to piece back Henny's life, I had been able to at least try to figure out what it would have been like to be in her situation, a hired out enslaved girl in a very complex situation in an urban area coming from a farm in Northern Virginia. And although I couldn't piece back to her life in the way that I would have preferred to do so, I think we all would like to have a perfect picture of what an enslaved person's life would have been like. I think the collection itself and being able to have the physical record, it's not so much about the roadblock itself. I mean, there's a lot of research for roadblocks, I think, when you're studying the history of enslaved people, because it just tends to be such a complicated situation. But what it did do was give me a level of confidence that I've carried with me throughout other complicated studies of enslaved communities and working with descendants and working with my own family. It's, I think, giving me the confidence to know that you kind of have to keep pushing forward because those people's memories matter.
I'll talk about a roadblock. My family's from Pittsylvania County, and they've been there for as long as I can remember. And I would ask my grandfather, who was born in 1897, to tell me about his family. And one day he sat me down and he told me everything he knew about certain ancestors, his father and his grandfather, whose name was Green Smith. And he said he was a free person. He would say he was never a slave. And I wanted to start to understand that community from Chatham, Virginia, between Danville, where my family's from, and get a better understanding of the history. So I started researching Green. And many years ago, I found him in the 1850 census. He was about 26 years old. He was listed as a free mulatto. And for a long time, I couldn't find anything past before 1850. I knew that all of his children were born and they were not enslaved. I knew that at some point I could find him in the 1870 census, in the 1880 census. I know he died in around 1880, 1898, somewhere around then. He's buried in a family cemetery. But there was this proverbial roadblock, like, what were their lives like? What were they doing? Where did they live? What went on? And why can't I find his mother? That's something I'm still searching for. That's a roadblock. But with the Virginia Untold collection, I started researching it, and I started to get a better picture of what life was like in Pittsylvania County, some of the not so nice parts. So as Ms. Stewart says, I understood sometimes I had to sit back when I would see lists of slaves transported to be sold or executed and are now in the prison. You know, and you read all those names and you want to know those stories. These are human beings. What happened? What were they doing? What was the outcome? You know, in my head, the characters start to form and these stories start to come to life. You know, do I see someone walking in front of the courthouse crying? Do I see my great-great-grandfather sitting in a chair and I'm trying to have an interview with him, So kind of going backwards and saying, well, where are you? But then there's a document called the Pennsylvania Report of the County Report to the Board of Commissions for Transporting Free Persons back to Liberia. This is a random document in Pennsylvania County in the Library of Virginia. And I'm reading the names, and I'm really reading the names. And lo and behold, in 1833, there's a young mulatto named Green Smith who's 9 years of age. And I'm putting the timeline and the pieces together. And I'm thinking, this may be him. But then I went further because everybody on this list had a story. Everyone, and I counted about 302 free persons of color in this list. And I'm starting to do more research on the other stories and the other people in this list, because it was this volunteer list of free people of color who were invited to be part of that movement to return to life, or to immigrate to Liberia. There was actually one person who volunteered to do that. His name was James Valentine, born about 1770. And he was the one person, and I'll talk more about that because his story is beginning to interest me, of why, who was he and why. And there's such a wealth of resources, but it's the stories of these people and the communities that they lived. So now it took me back to looking at that 1850 census in an entirely different way. Now I'm looking at patterns. Where did everybody live? Can I get some other information? Were you a farmer? Were you a cook? Were you a seamstress? Because there are men and women. And in this document, which shocked me when I really read it, because sometimes when we research family members, we go through one person. I just want to see this one person if he's on there. I don't care about anybody else. And I stopped and I said, there's stories here. They documented in 1833 in Pennsylvania County, the youngest person on this list, her name was Agnes Stevens. She was 8 days old in 1833. The oldest individual was 80 years old, and her name was Hannah. And what are the stories in between? And I'm still learning.
I think one of my brick walls was at the beginning, before, when we were still doing microfilm and all that, and researching a family in Henry County, Virginia, the Stovall's. And I noticed in the chat that I've seen one or two people saying that they researched Stovall's, but I joined there was a Stovall Family Association, which I joined. They had a very nice newsletter. And for the most part, all of their members were white. But I did speak to the publisher and I asked him, you could write queries. And I wrote a query and he published it. And I didn't get a response, but that was fine. I know all about Bartholomew Stovall, who came to this country from England and whatever. But one time, a couple of years in the late 1990s, I think the Library of Virginia had a seminar. And I went and I asked the speaker a question, which, forget what the question was. I must have been about Henry County, but he didn't really have an answer. But afterwards, there was a gentleman by the name of John Harris who came up to me. And John Harris was from Henry County. And John Harris had found the cohabitation register for Henry County. And John Harris had transcribed it. Now the register, the cohabitation register, is now on your site. But at that time, it was not. He sent me a copy of his transcription. And lo and behold, at the point of this cohabitation register is generated in 1866, after the war, where Virginia was legitimizing those relationships that took place prior to emancipation. And for the Henry County Register, it gives the name of the husband, the wife, and what children they had, when had they started cohabitating, and it gave the name of the former owner. And the former owner, the last former owners, were not Stovall's, which led me to find that the original owner had passed, and there is a chancery case that I have not gotten to yet, in which other family members were fighting over the will. And those slaves that he owned apparently had been sold. So you can see the transition from the fact that this register was in a courthouse that this very nice gentleman had transcribed, and I happened to ask the question. But now with digitization, it's there for people to look and see. And I'm sure in many courthouses, there are things that people don't realize are there and need to be digitized. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate the variety of responses to that question. I think you all are all touching on, in many ways, understanding the context behind these documents. There's a larger context that has to be understood. Like you've said, these documents were not generated by the people that were researching, right? They were not the ones in power. We have to understand that. They're fragments of their story. We won't have the whole story. And then, in terms of when and how they were generated, at what's going on in the world that's motivating these white officials, public officials, to create these documents. And Wendy actually was bringing this up in some of her points as well, that as a librarian, as a teacher, she has to help her students to understand this context too. We have to know the history in order to do powerful research. And I wonder if you all can speak any more on that, how you place these stories, just like you were saying, Joanne, you want to just broaden out, you want to know everything. How do we take the small narrative and place it in the larger context without losing the individuality of that person? And that question is not all that well articulated, but I just want to give us a little more of a chance to talk about this contextual question, which I think is really important to researching Black history.
Part of me looks for patterns. So when I take the document I mentioned before, this one, in 1833, that's what's available in the Virginia Untold. There's actually a second document that has 37 people. A couple of them are in both the documents, and it's the index to the list of free Blacks in 1833. So now I have two documents in the same time frame. So what I want to know next is, what was going on here? Where were these handwritten documents? Including, there was also the Register of Free Negroes, which the earliest entry is about 1807. That runs from 1807 to 1865. So what I did is how I think sometimes I started cross-referencing these names. I would pick some of the names out of the first document, the report of the county for those that were, who were free persons of color offered to immigrate to Liberia. I took that list and I found there was approximately 140 people who were also in the Book of Free Negroes for Pittsylvania County. But what's interesting is that some of these individuals registered after 1833, such as 1839, for example. So then my question is, based on the laws, why was there a lag time? Was this a precursor to gather who is free in the county at this time? But I kind of want to learn, I'm not sure in the document, I need to reread it, like who actually did this? Like who went out and collected these names? Where did they find all these people? How did they know? Did they find Agnes, who was 8 days old, because her mother's 24 and was also Agnes? They go to the house or someone says she also has a baby. What's the story there, and why 1833? And I don't know if there are any other documents. Now, when I've tried to look at the 1840 census, and it's been a while, a lot of it's still slave schedules. So I'm not seeing these individuals, or some of them were too young. Like if I use my great-grandfather in 1840, he would have been too young to be listed as an adult. So he appears in 1850. So this 1833 has just been like, I've been thinking about it, like, what else do I need to learn? What other records do I need to go to the courthouse and find out what's going on? something was going on in 1833.
Yeah, Joanne, I think those are really great questions to be asking. And I think that as I can see from the chat right now, one of the ways is by putting it out to our fellow researchers, right? I bet there are people watching tonight that have some of the answers to those questions. And I mean, the short answer is that universally, they're not sort of enacting these laws in the same way. But I think that to that point, it is just really important that we're sharing our questions as well as our answers. Who else has been running into these problems? I do want to give Selma or Peyton an opportunity to comment on the last question. If they have answers, we can also move on though.
I do. If Selma's okay with that, going forward. There's actually one of the most absolutely interesting stories that I've ever come across, not just in Virginia Untold, but just in general at any site that I've ever worked at, was when I was working at Preservation, Virginia, as a site historian at Bacon's Castle a few years ago. And when I came into doing that research, part of the reason why I was asked to do the research is because they wanted more information about the history of Black life at Bacon's Castle and in the surrounding area after 1800. And I started looking through Virginia Untold, just various different types of records, and I came across a public claim and a transportation record for a man named John, alias Johnlaiborne, which was in air quotes in the public claim. And John had apparently run several miles from Surrey all the way to Northampton to be a part of Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831. And I was completely amazed at the distance, because if anybody knows Surrey County, it's, there's, especially in the 19th century, it's a lot of open space. So to get from point A to point B, that's going to take some elbow grease. So I was genuinely surprised just at the distance of itself. And he had been convicted of being a participant. It didn't explain what exactly he had done, but he had been transported to, I believe, Alabama, and that's kind of where my trail stopped. But I hadn't heard of anybody from Surrey being a part of Nat Turner's rebellion at that time. So I continued looking at public claims, and I found that there was actually a tiny group of men who may or may not have been involved with Johnlaiborne, who had started a group that would go to different plantations, specifically large-scale plantations with absentee farmers or absentee plantation owners, and would try to recruit people to be a part of the rebellion. And both of these men have a handful of records in the public claims under specifically the Nat Turner Rebellion section of Virginia Untold's public claims that talk about these two men basically kind of spilling the beans on each other and saying, yeah, this was something that we planned to do. Exactly what they planned to do when they got to Northampton is, or maybe Southampton, might be mixing up my counties. But what they planned to do when they got there wasn't entirely clear. But what I found amazing by just following these breadcrumbs was this incredible network of people that had come together to fight for a cause that they believed to be right for themselves, to achieve their own agency, to fight for their own agency, and how far that extended out into Virginia. And I thought just this idea of this massive community of enslaved people coming together through networks of people probably being hired out and going from different counties to different counties and coming together in this way, even though they'd obviously been convicted. And I obviously understand that Nat Turner's rebellion in general is a hotly contested kind of a situation. But I think one of the things that's important to take away from that is that oftentimes I think we're a little more separated from our history, our community histories, than we should be. And we think of these historical events as these just big historical events that you see on a documentary, or you see a history professor talk about, or you see a C-SPAN panel or something kind of lofty and distant away from us is typically how we end up seeing a lot of these events. And we never really, I think, get to the people on the ground in the way that we should. And I think just looking at Johnlaiborne and the lengths that he may have gone to fight for something that he thought was worth his own personal safety in his life it's a good reason for continuing to do this kind of work. I think we've all mentioned that it's difficult to be able to completely, I think, put fragments back together, but every fragment we can put back together is putting together somebody's life story and what their connection and relationship to a community of people was.
Thank you so much, Peyton, for that. I think that it reminded me of something I think about a lot, is that we use the word stories to describe the experiences of these individuals, but they're not stories, are they? They were real people that happened, that experienced something in a real place, in a real time. And it segues really nicely into the question that I want to ask you all next, which is, you've talked a lot about the things you've learned about these other people and learned about their communities even. What is something you've learned about yourself in researching these people or doing this type of research?
That I guess, well, at least for me, that we all have a story to tell. And maybe I hadn't really thought of that question, but what will my children say? Or what will my grandchildren say? I mean, I'm looking back, 3, 4, 5, 6 generations, but I'm also going to be part of that story. And yeah, I'm not sure how to answer that. Yeah. I am tenacious though, because I have been at this for a while, as all of us have been, and probably the people who are in the room. I think we owe it to the people that came before us to say their name. That's how I look at it.
I think as far as like how this kind of what this all means for me and what it's made me realize about myself is it wasn't until I got into the field that I realized where my relatives had been enslaved and having records of them and being able to show my family where people were at different times. And I think maybe unfortunately, out of all the descendants that I have worked with to try and piece their family histories back together, I've not been able to do that for myself or my own relatives. And part of me enjoys doing this work because when I can do that for somebody else, I'm like, this is good. I may not be able to do that for me, but at least I can do that for somebody else. I hope that might change. Like right now, my relatives that are buried in Richmond, that have been buried at historic Black cemeteries there, I have burial cards for them, I have records for them, but unfortunately, because of some of the issues with the care of the cemeteries, they're kind of lost in the woods somewhere. And even though I've looked for years, I can't find where they're buried. So if I can do that for other people, that means a lot. And I guess, also as Selma said, even though I haven't been doing this since 1991, I'm gonna keep going. Me and my Hyundai keep rolling around Virginia trying to find people. That's just what I'm gonna keep doing. So.
Well, can I say something else though too? I think when you start doing this research, you realize that this research is, you are part of, the people you're looking for are part of the history. Their history is part of their community and the larger story. And, I think we have an obligation to try to tell it, whether it's just a fragment, whether it's A lot, we find a lot or whatever. And sometimes finding a lot means that you have to go into some very unpleasant places like chancery records and other kind of files. And so you have to admit, but I think their stories are worth telling and preserving. And so, you know.
I've just learned that I can't stop. I gotta keep going. I ask myself these questions and I want to find the answers or find what's going on, if there's a historical event or not, to bring these stories of these human beings, these individuals to life. I want my ancestors, my family, I want people on this call to really understand, the history of our survival, how we managed to overcome and live. Because when I look at, for example, some of these lists where they had free people of color, freedom in 1833 is a whole lot different, but somewhat the same as it is now. Freedom was you were in a box, but what did that box look like? How did you make it through? You may live next door to relatives who were enslaved, and these stories and these connections in these communities, we need to know about them. They need to be heard and they need to be told. And I can't stop. Once you start and get into this, I feel like I'm compelled. Like they're speaking to me and saying, keep going, don't stop.
Thank you guys for sharing that. I am going to kind of switch gears, but also touching on what you all mentioned about not being able to stop, going local, driving your Hyundai around the state, looking at chancery records, all of those things that don't exist within the Virginia Untold database, right? So that's a starting point, but you have to go outside of it. So I'm wondering if you guys can talk a little bit about where else you go. Joanne, you were talking about this the 1833 law. You're asking yourself, what's happening in 1833? Where did you go to figure that answer out? Others, if you would like to weigh in on how you have taken a document you found in Virginia Untold and then gone beyond that. If you could give an example of contextual or background research you've had to do, or moving from the database to chancery, however you'd like to take that question. But I'm trying to get people to move from this confined set of records in the database outward to all that there is out there.
Well, I haven't figured out the 1833 conundrum yet, but I have gone to the Chatham courthouse. It's been a while. Probably the next time I go, I need to bring cupcakes and flowers for everybody. But really spending that time with a cousin, digging through records, sometimes without even a map to go on. I started looking at tax records. I'm like, I think, if you own land, and nestled in one of the 1860 tax ledgers was just a piece of paper. And on that paper, it listed more free people of color in the land that they own. And there were men and women on that. I mean, and that's what scares me, is that sometimes there's these pieces of paper nestled in a book, not documented anywhere, but that is a huge piece of history. It's a huge piece of African-American history that needs to be preserved. So, you've done maybe ancestry, you've looked at census records, other records, but then there are like these small little records that need to be preserved. And that's what scares me. It's like, I just kind of want to go out and like grab all the boxes and like store them and then transcribe them, because it's tough.
So do I. I understand that.
For 1833, you want to look for Robert Vernon, who a number of years ago, have you heard his name before? He lives in Albemarle, and a number of years ago, he compiled a list. That 1833 list, it's a list of Blacks who wanted to go to Liberia, or who the state kind of wanted them to go to Liberia. And so, but when you're doing research, what I found is you have to know the law, because one of my first books I got was The Black Laws of Virginia by June Purcell Gill, because laws generate, either the complying with the law or non-compliance generates documents. And so, for free Blacks, not only do you have the Free Negro Registers, but you have the Commissioner of the Revenue List, which comes along a couple of years later. So in some counties, you have both of those things going on. I was looking at the Black Laws of Virginia and reading, history books on Virginia, Virginia history, and trying to see what was going on in those communities at the time and the laws. And so you get a context. And I probably appreciate historians more than I did when I was, in college, having to read all those things, because they have great footnotes. I don't necessarily always agree with, their hypothesis or what they're saying, but they have great footnotes and endnotes and their sources. And they're not always looking for what you're looking for, or, they're looking at a bigger picture and you're looking for the smaller thing.
Yeah, thanks for that, Selma. And I think that Ashley actually just dropped in the chat the link to Black Laws, which is open on my desk every day. It's a great source.
One of the things I wanted to mention, actually, maybe, I don't know if it's like kind of an unconventional answer, but one of the things, especially working with coroner's inquests for 2.5 years straight, probably being a little bit too buried in coroner's inquests, is I found the importance of place to matter. I think a lot more than I understood previous to interacting with them as often as I did. Because at this point, my Hyundai should be an employee of my employer as well as myself. Because we really just be going crisscrossing this entire state. I don't think that there's a place in the state this car hasn't been. But one of the things that I started to notice is, as I would be out working, going to courthouses, visiting plantations, or documenting cemeteries that I would need to document for work, I was coming across all of the places I had encountered in the coroner's records. I've walked in the same piers that people had. There have been records of people falling off of. I've come to the same towns that plantations had once been, where there had been conflicts that had unfortunately led to the deaths of enslaved people. And I think walking in those spaces, especially, I think if you're particularly interested in genealogy, one of the things I think as a public historian that I've tried to instill, I think, in the people that I speak to, or if I do education programs, is to think of, as a Black person, to think of the African-American community more broadly in Virginia as your family. And you have these kinds of, it's a very particular type of connection, I think. For example, walking around Bacon's Castle's plantation after talking to descendants who can trace their relatives back there to 1800. You're not just walking on empty grass or empty space, you're walking where other people live their lives. And being able to see, for example, Seven Pines is just down the street from me in Sandston, which I didn't realize until a couple of years ago was in one of the inquests that I had found that had been deeply tied to a person's life. And I just kind of had to sit in the car and be like, this is somebody's community, somebody's life is tied to this place. And it's, again, just, I think, connecting life and experiences to places and taking them off of a sheet of paper that a white official made, and remembering that these are fragments of people's existences that do matter. And that, I think, without the work of the people who do this kind of work, genealogists, descendant advocates, historians, I mean, all of these people would be completely absent from American historical memory, like, period. that's the way it would be if there wasn't that kind of tenacity and that persistence to just keep going, because all of these places and these people matter. We're not just, they're not arbitrary, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. There's so much connection that can be made, I think, if you really just engage the records, not just as pieces of paper, but as people and lives and communities that you can engage with and be a part of, I think, as a Virginian in general.
I think the power of place is such an important piece, and I'm really glad you brought that up, because as an archivist, we're really moved sometimes from that historical place sort of context, and especially in the case of Virginia Untold, where you're accessing something completely online, you are removed almost entirely. And I think it's just a good reminder that research is much more holistic than just staring at a screen. And my next question is kind of related. It also is tied into what Joanne was saying about finding a little slip of paper in a book and thinking about all the things that are out there that we want to preserve and we want to share with people. And I think a lot in my day-to-day work about where Virginia Untold will go next. What is the future of it? Do we digitize everything in the library, and what does that look like? How in the world do you prioritize all that is out there? And I wonder if you all have thoughts about how we grow this collection. I mean, the question could be, do we grow this collection? Do we continue to do that? Or do we focus on the documents that are there? And if we are thinking about how to grow the collection, what do we prioritize? What do we think about? What does the future look like for work like this? You can speak generally, or you could speak very specifically to the Virginia Untold project.
Is your question what you think should be added to the site, or?
It could be. So that's kind of a sub question. Basically, what do you think the priority should be for Virginia Untold? And that could be adding more documents and what those might be. It could be focused on reaching new users or a new audience. It could be technology changes.
Do you have county deeds?
Yes. Do you mean deeds of emancipation?
No. There's probably a proper name.
But deeds of transfer, like land deeds?
They could be. I would say this. Unfortunately, in some county courts, there are simply just books of deeds, and they're just collections of deeds, but unspecified deeds. But what I had found, I had gone, I went to Campbell a couple of weeks ago to do some research for Red Hill, and most of the deed books for Charlotte and Campbell, they're about 560 pages. And if they have an index, that's a good day. But most of the time they don't have an index. So you just kind of have to go page by page and just know who you're looking for when something is supposed to have occurred.
Yes.
And I know like the amount of labor that would be involved in digitizing something like that just for one county would be sizable. But I think a good reason for doing it is I had found at Red Hill, we'd been having some difficulty finding who had been enslaved or brought into Red Hill's plantation enslaved between 1831 and 1861. And I started to find people like on page 231 of these deeds of people who had been purchased as property and thus became part of the deed book in the county for transfers of property between people. And I have to go back there at some point very, very soon, because the amount of people that are lost in those hundreds and hundreds of pages is just kind of like, and you want to fix it, but it's obviously difficult for one person to try and do that. And I can't imagine how many other people's, ancestors are kind of just trapped in the pages of a deed book, of a collections of dozens of different types of deeds. So if there was a way of being able to do that and make it easily accessible to the public through digital means, I think that would be tremendously helpful, because I didn't realize just how many people were kind of caught in that.
Yeah, that I think you make a great point, Peyton. I don't want to cut you off, Selma. I'm sorry. I was just going to say that minute books and court order books are a similar situation where there's just names, identities trapped in these pages. So I think that's great. Thank you.
Can I make, a couple of years ago, I worked on a project. It's called the Brantley Association Southampton Project. And no, I don't research Southampton, but this gentleman went to the South, was allowed to go to the Southampton County Courthouse. And he scanned all the documents that were in the courthouse. Wills, deeds, I mean, they have a website. If you go to the Brantley Association Southampton Project, you'll see it. And he got volunteers to, we did not transcribe them. We just had to index every name that appeared, either the name of the people or a place or something else. And it was his hope that other counties would start that kind of project where they would allow, someone to go in there and take pictures or would digitize it or whatever, and then volunteers would do it. And, but I don't know if, I don't know that that's kind of happened, but that was that was his project. His family was originally from Southampton, I guess was there in the 1600s or whatever. And he just felt it was important, and the clerk of the court allowed him to do that. And, you have the original image and then the index, and you can, so yes, and county court order books are some of my favorite. I love county court books and minute books, so.
Yeah, I think those are great suggestions. And it does have a lot to do with the relationship with the clerks too, and getting out
Right.
in counties. Yeah, I think that's a great point. Joanne, did you want to weigh in at all before we sort of wrap up our more formal time this evening?
Sorry. I think all those suggestions are good. Sometimes I also think about tax records, pre-Civil War, and the land deeds as well.
Thank you for those suggestions. You all, there's about 20 minutes left of our program, and I do want to transition us to a Q&A time. There are a lot of people on this call. I would like us to at least try to use the opportunity for asking a question, unmuting yourself and asking a question, if you would like to do so. If you feel more comfortable putting it in the chat, that is totally fine as well. I see that there are already many questions in the chat, so I can try to take a look, but I'm just going to kind of open it up. I'm going to try this. I don't know how it's going to go since there's so many of us, but I'm going to at least try to open it up to anybody that would like to ask a question. Okay, we have a shy group this evening, so I'm gonna switch gears because I've been seeing some really interesting questions in the chat tonight. There's always the opportunity for anybody to speak up as we start a little bit more of our conversation. I saw an interesting question that says, so panelists, wondering how you all would answer this question. Do the current political efforts to suppress the truth about enslavement, banning of books, concern you as it relates to the future preservation and accessibility to genealogical Black history records in the future?
Absolutely.
Definitely.
Yeah, that's actually the thing is like the historical sites, it's it's really been interesting. I think in the last 3 years since the commemoration 1619 project and then the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020, there's been this mad dash, I think, of a lot of historical sites that are trying to figure out how in the world to approach Black history in any way, shape, or form. And I think that's butting up against a lot of the social tensions that are trying to erase Blackness as an important aspect of not only Virginia's history, but America's history. And I think in a lot of ways, it's becoming this fight, becoming more of a fight than it should, to, I think, elevate Black history in a way that it's considered just as important. And not even just as important, but centered as a main part of Virginia and the nation's historical narratives. It needs to be. So I think it's one of those things where if this is something that means to you, you know, we could use all the help we could get in the field, I think, to ensure that its importance is never lost. Because it just seems like sometimes you may take 2 steps forward and 10 steps back and trying to, I don't know, get to that hilltop and say, yes, this is extremely important. You need to know. It needs to be a part of curriculum. It needs to be a part of public site programming. It needs to, archives need to be accessible to descendant communities and broader communities, all of those things. It's just something that we have to keep fighting for.
Selma, Joanne, do you all have thoughts?
I support what Peyton says wholeheartedly. The stories need to be told, and there's just been such a change in the last few years. I think now more than ever, we really need to make sure that we have the documentation preserved for future generations.
I agree. But the truth of the matter is, prior to emancipation, I mean, the documents in which the formerly enslaved names appear or whatever are in the documents of whites. So I mean, if you're gonna destroy something, then you're destroying your will, your deed. I mean, that's where these names appear, because the formerly the enslaved are not speaking for themselves.
It's a shared history.
It wasn't a shared equal history, but it was a shared history. I mean, it is,
It's the history, yeah. Can you all share some of the ways that you organize your research as you're working so that you can locate it later? I think this is so crucial. I know that you all probably have some trial and error answers. So yeah, anything you want to offer, maybe a good story or.
No.
I just feel like the fact that we're all laughing tells me we are all on the same page in this one.
Next question.
Next.
My books are neat, though.
I mean, I wish I could say I'm really organized and using EndNote or some other software, but it's a lot of online files, folders, some links, but it's all over the place.
Well, I will say, because I started early, before the use of computers and stuff, I have a lot of binders. So because I'm a paper person too. So I'll print things out and put it in the binder and have it by family names and, those type of things. But a lot of people now, I mean, they're using online organization type things, and I'm not the person to give that, offer any assistance on that.
I will say that the way I've started doing it recently is I make social histories. I think that's just the academic in me, maybe, because it'll never once you just kind of get stuck in the academic wheel, you never really shake it off, I think. But I've started to make social histories of places and people. And right now for Red Hills, I've got like 60 pages of just people, their families, even if it's just records of censuses, pictures of places that I've been to or archival records that I've gotten scans of or things like that. That helps me, I guess, just continue attaching it to something concrete rather than being, I guess, like just a collection of records of what I used to do were legal pads, and then it became dozens of legal pads, and that just didn't work out. So social histories, if you're down to sit and type for a little bit, it's a nice way, I think, to see what you're finding and what it's like, even if it's just a few pieces of information or a few sentences, just stitching together those fragmentary pieces of information. But I think it helps.
And I guess I can add, I keep spreadsheets, so I'll have links to documents, I'll have photos, so I can sort by name or by place. So as they do, and I also keep binders too. And some stuff I've scanned, and I have like a digital folder, and it's the index to kind of find stuff as well.
Thank you, guys. I just want to answer some questions that I see that are reoccurring in our sheet. So first of all, this question is for us, or me. The event is being recorded, and it will be archived or shared on the library's YouTube page, and I will have it as well. I can send it to you. You can get in contact with me. I will have it. And then there's a question about if we have social media. It just says, do you guys have social media? I'm assuming it means the panelists. The Library of Virginia does have a Twitter, Instagram, Facebook account, and we talk about Virginia Untold on those channels. But because there have been so many questions to you all, the panelists, I'm sure it would be very interesting for those watching tonight if you all have social media. Or a way that people can get in contact with you to follow up about some of these specific research questions. I see lots of specific questions around y'all's family and family names.
If you want to reach out, feel free to message me on Facebook. That's probably the easiest way to get in touch with me. So, and I did see that somebody had a connection to Amelia County. So if you want to speak, that would be cool too. I'd love anything that I can learn about potential relatives or connections to Amelia would be great.
Yes, Sam, you can find me on Facebook.
Same for me on Facebook.
So we've gotten this question now a couple times about, I wonder if any of you all have familiarity with hospital records or dealing with roadblocks related to hospitalization. This person asked, my information on my fraternal grandfather who was admitted and passed at Western State Hospital while my father was in college. This is a little specific, but I'm curious if you all have any suggestions there.
What time frame is this?
The person did not say.
Oh.
Yeah, I mean, it's really a question around accessing state hospital records past the statute of limitations. But
all right.
Is this an issue where the actual hospital itself is not releasing records or it's no longer accessible? Because I've had a similar issue, but I had found that my relative's records, somebody who had been hospitalized almost 80 years ago, I suppose now, no longer accessible, then I would look and see if there are any universities or private organizations or digital projects that have taken them. Because at least I had noticed I had a relative that was at a hospital in Petersburg in around 1949, and her records ended up in a different state. But they still exist, but they're just moved in a different state. So I would recommend looking at potential either Black history programs that are digitizing hospital records, because it is something that's been done in the last couple of years. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, King Davis, and yeah. Yep.
Central State, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's a great suggestion. We have 7 minutes left, and I want to end by asking a question almost here at the end. How can we help to continue to emphasize the importance of Black lives and Black history? So this question is, we've touched on it in many ways, but feel free to elaborate or be as specific as possible.
Well, one of the things that like to see is specifically, both locality and state institutions doing more to support preserving Black historic spaces and history. So, for example, we're having a similar problem with historic Black cemeteries in the Richmond metro area. And there's been a significant disconnect between state institutions and, I think, providing solid regulatory measures for ensuring that Black cemeteries are preserved in a way that is in line with what descendants want. And I think one of the problems is oftentimes when it comes to historical sites, museums or whatever, where there are living people who are still tied to those spaces ancestrally, personally, there isn't enough effort, I think, made to build that bridge between the community and the institution that I think would be extremely meaningful. If more time was put into that. It just goes back again to what we've been talking about tonight. It's just thinking of ourselves as a community, and as a community, in order to maintain the community, we have to support each other. I think doing that for historic Black sites would be helpful. I think pushing for historic Black sites to feature Black history and other marginalized groups' history, as well as center focus as being an important element of that site's history, rather than just a fleeting, random almost characterization of an enslaved person just to stick diversity there for a hot minute, is not the way to do it. And I think we're far past the point where that's something that needs to be done. So just supporting, I think, a better interpretation of history, a more community-focused involvement, more community-centered history. I think that's the way that you show that Black lives and Black life and Black experiences are important to these institutions, and they are important to the state's history.
I think STAR is holding, I think some of the questions in the chat that's been going on, I've been reading, I think this is a start. I think working with other institutions, so there's some connections and sharing of information. That's another start, and to make sure that we secure constant and consistent funding so that we have the ability to continue to do the preservation of anything and everything related to African American history. And funding is the key, getting that support and looking those streams and really communicating with, like, what's Duke doing, what's UVA doing, for example, if we're talking about Virginia. Who has what records? And can we have, basically, I call it a data sharing agreement, where we can start to have access so that we're working in silos sometimes. That's also really important.
Yeah, I agree with that. Institutions need to do a better job of not being so territorial, I think. And it actually, I want to ask another question. I lied, that's not the last one, because this is really interesting to me. What will happen to your research when you retire? Is it in your wills? Are you giving it to an organization or a museum? It's related to the question of how we emphasize this history. How are you all leaving behind all that you're doing? Have you thought about it?
I've thought about it because I'm the mother of 3 sons, and I'm afraid when I'm gone, it's going somewhere. But, yes, probably leave it to some repository. Not all of it, but, parts of it. Maybe leave, copies so that family members have it. They can be shared. And, but it's probably, yes, a good idea that it be left. Not just mine, but I mean, everybody. We've put a lot of work. We've collected a lot of information. And it would be a shame that it would all be lost.
Well, I've been sharing with my family members, so that's one way. I'm gonna, as I'm organizing all my thoughts and all the research I get, really sharing, and hopefully I can inspire someone who's coming after me in the next generation, such as my nephew, to pick up the torch That's what I hope. And maybe at some point write a small book. Maybe 1 or 2 people will buy it, or it'll be in a library somewhere, but at least it'll be there and it'll be searchable.
My dad was telling me recently that I should make a book of my travels, gallivanting across Virginia and North Carolina. And I think that's something that I would like to do, because my relatives moved. I mean, my relatives stretch from Alabama to New York, and we moved to a lot of places because of the Great Migration. And I'm used to chasing down things. And when it's my time, there's going to be a lot in that book. It may have multiple volumes. Who knows? I have no idea. But I'll probably leave my belongings, however chaotic it will look, probably to my niece. And she'll just be like, "Why'd you do this to me?" I have it. My niece is very new. She's actually only a month old, like a couple of days ago. But yeah, probably I'd like to leave some kind of an archive for my family. I do hope, I think there's a part of me that hopes that when I'm older, decades from now, that this isn't the kind of work that will need to be done, I think, as hard as we've had to do. If that makes sense. Like I hope that it's not. I hope that people aren't in the same situation. I hope that records are more accessible. I think if there's a national repository, at least, or even a state repository that, I think like the Black community members can trust, I'd like to go there. Something that would just make it accessible. Because, yeah, accessibility is just kind of like a huge thing for me. It doesn't mean a whole lot if it's just sitting on my computer or sitting in a legal binder or whatever. So if I could find some way of doing that, then my relatives can sift through the rest of my crazy travels, that's cool with me.
Thanks for sharing that, Peyton. And thank you for saying the word that librarians think about a lot, accessibility. And it's, I think, a great point to end on, and a concept that we've talked about a lot this evening. I think it is so important that these things are preserved and accessible. The conversation will continue long after all of us are gone. I just want to thank my panelists, Joanne, Selma, and Peyton, so much for your time this evening. I enjoyed listening to you all so much, and it really enriches what I do in my office alone every day, knowing that it's out there being used and being digested in really meaningful ways. It's going somewhere and it's having an impact. And that's really important for me. And I know it's important for the people listening tonight. So I just want to thank everybody that was able to join us. Again, this has been recorded and it is going to be available probably by next week. So you will have a chance to check it out. Thank you all again. And I look forward to having more events like these and hearing from you all in the future.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.